Hi, I'm Lynn Blend. I'm a drag queen, a Vtuber, and a true crime enthusiast, and on this channel I do videos about historical true crime cases and mysteries. Today I'll be looking into the case of serial killer John Christie and the innocent man who was executed for his crimes. Before we get started, I do just want to mention that this video will contain brief discussions of domestic violence and child abuse, as well as discussions of violence against women and sexual assault. So please do use your discretion in watching and prioritize your mental health first and foremost. This story begins with us looking into a man named Timothy Evans. Now, Timothy was born on November 20th, 1924 in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales. His father left the family before his birth, leaving his mother to raise him and his older sister Eileen on her own until she remarried in 1933. The family then moved to London in 1935. Here's some things that you really need to keep in mind about Timothy Evans that will be really important later in this story. Timothy was intellectually disabled. He struggled while learning to speak. He could barely read or write well into his adulthood. And he was also unable to attend school for long periods of time as a child because of a chronic bacterial infection in his foot that started when he was 8 years old. Because of all these factors, because of his intellectual disability, he was very easily manipulated and prone to telling outlandish stories. In 1946, Timothy met Beryl Thorley, who would become his wife a year later. When the young couple were expecting their first child, they decided to move to a larger home to accommodate their growing family, and they ended up settling down in the upstairs apartment of 10 Rillington Place in Notting Hill, where they met their downstairs neighbors, John and Ethel Christie. We'll learn more about them in a bit. Just keep those names in your brain for now. Just remember they're living in the same building as the Evanses, just downstairs. Timothy and Beryl Evans' daughter Geraldine was born in 1948, but the family situation was anything but ideal. Timothy struggled to support his family on the income from his van driver job, and on top of that, he became an alcoholic and he was prone to violent outbursts. When Beryl became pregnant for the second time in 1949, she decided that she wanted to get an abortion rather than raise another child in this chaotic environment, but abortions were illegal at that time. What actually happened after this would only be learned later, but police involvement in the investigation started on November 30th, 1949, when Timothy Evans walked into the police station near his hometown in South Wales and confessed to putting his wife's body down a drain. In that first confession, Evans stated that his wife drank a concoction that was supposed to abort her pregnancy, but it ended up killing her, and in a panic he hid her body in the storm drain and then left to stay with his family in Wales. But when police went to the property and searched the storm drain, it took 3 different officers to pull off the manhole cover that Evans supposedly removed on his own, and they found nothing, no body, nothing. This story also didn't explain what happened to the baby Geraldine, who was also missing. Personally, I feel like this alone should have been enough to raise some suspicion with the police that something was up with Timothy's story, but they kept pressing. And in his second confession, he told the police that he had entrusted his wife to the care of his downstairs neighbor, John Christie, who had told Timothy that he was going to perform Beryl's abortion. Timothy then went to work, but when he returned, Christie told him that Beryl was dead, and that he would hide her body in the storm drain and find a family for Geraldine to stay with. Christie also convinced Evans to leave town, prompting him to go stay with his family in Wales for the 2 weeks leading up to him initially going to the police station. So the police went to search the property again, and this time they actually did find the bodies of Beryl and Geraldine, but almost nothing about their deaths lined up with Timothy's story. Timothy didn't even know that his daughter was dead until he was told by the police. Their bodies were found in the wash house on the property, not in the storm drain like he said, and they were both strangled. Instead of doing further investigation into what actually had caused Beryl and Geraldine's deaths, the police were convinced that they had their man, and that they just had to make Evan's story line up with what actually happened, and suppress any evidence that proved otherwise. Evans' third confession, which was written, claimed that he got into an argument with Beryl about money. He flew into a rage and then strangled his wife and child and hid their bodies in the wash house. If you remember from earlier in the story, Evans could barely read and write, though, and it later came out that this confession was actually written by the police, who then read it to him and made him sign it. The evidence of the time cards from Timothy's job, which would have proven his alibi, also mysteriously went missing. Even more disturbing, a group of small children who were playing in a bombed-out abandoned building near Evans and Christie's Notting Hill apartment building came across a human skull. They turned the skull into the police, who never followed up on it. Okay, now keep in mind that this was in London right after World War II. There were a lot of abandoned bomb sites in the area. They probably saw that this skull was found there and assumed that it was somebody who had died in a bombing. But I don't know, at least look into it. Maybe even if it was somebody who had died in the bombing, wouldn't they try to find out who it was? That just doesn't make any sense to me. When the case went to trial, Evans recanted his confession, and finally the truth came out. First, John Christie took the opportunity of Beryl Evans seeking an abortion to kill her and her child, and then he manipulated Timothy Evans into believing that Beryl's death had been an accident, and that their child was safe in the care of another family, and that he should leave town for a while. Timothy, who was very gullible and easily manipulated because of his intellectual disability, fell for the whole thing. When the police presented him with the confession they wrote for him, he said that he signed it in fear that the police would beat him if he didn't. Unfortunately for Timothy Evans, this wasn't enough to convince a jury. The prosecution discredited him by bringing up his habit of making up stories and his rocky marriage with Beryl. And in comparison, John Christie seemed much more credible because he'd recently served in World War II, and his wife Ethel was there to testify on his behalf. Evans was found guilty, and on March 9th, 1950, he was hanged at just 25 years old. Now that it's apparent who the real killer of Beryl and Geraldine Evans was, let's get into a bit of background on John Christie. John Christie was born in Yorkshire, England in 1899. His home life as a child was overseen by his overly strict parents, leaving him obsessed with controlling others as an adult. He had a fascination with corpses after seeing his grandfather's body at his funeral, and from then on as a teen and young adult, he developed increasingly disturbing sexual fantasies involving sexual assault, violence, and necrophilia. From the age of 19 onward, he would solicit the services of sex workers to help him act on these fantasies. In 1920, Christie married his wife Ethel, who would later testify on his behalf at Timothy Evans' murder trial. Shortly after they got married, Christie started working as a postman. The next year in 1921 began his first stint in prison. He got caught stealing hundreds of pounds worth of packages from his job, and he was sentenced to 3 months. A couple years after this, Christie ended up leaving his wife in Sheffield while he moved to London. While he was living on his own in London, he would continue to get in trouble with the law. For several years, it was mostly just petty thefts, but he ramped up to violent crime in 1928. That year, he moved in with a woman named Maud Claude and her son. His and Maud's situation was really tense, and they frequently argued about Christie not getting a job. This culminated with Christie hitting her across the back of the head with a cricket bat. Fortunately, Maud actually survived this incident, and Christie was sentenced to another 6 months in prison for the assault. After getting out of prison, Christie returned to his old ways, and this culminated in another 3 months in prison in 1933, after an incident where he stole a priest's car. After he got out of prison, he asked his estranged wife Ethel to move to London to live with him again, and she agreed. The two of them ended up moving into their downstairs apartment in 10 Rillington Place in Notting Hill in 1938, where John got a job at the local post office. John Christie's streak of murders began in 1943 with the murder of his 21-year-old mistress, Ruth First. Ruth was born on August 2nd, 1922, in Bad Vöslau, Austria. She moved to Vienna in October of 1938, but because she was half Jewish, she needed to flee the country in March of 1939 due to Germany's annexation of Austria. She ended up in Britain as a refugee in June of 1939. For the next couple years, she was working odd jobs, making her way to London, where she would work as a waitress in a hotel. And it's here that she met a man that she would start a relationship with, which would result in the two of them having a child in October of 1942. This child would later be given up for adoption. By 1943, Ruth had moved to the Notting Hill area, and this is where she met John Christie. The two of them began a brief affair which ended violently, seemingly completely on a whim from Christie. While John's wife Ethel was away in Sheffield visiting family, he invited Ruth over to Tender Lincoln Place. Perhaps in a desire to act on some of his more extreme fantasies, during sex he strangled her with a rope until she died. I don't know if this murder was premeditated, but my personal opinion here, I do think that he did intend to kill her, and that this wasn't just an accident or him getting too carried away. I'm going to base this opinion both on his history of escalating crimes up until this point and everything that he would do after this in the years to follow. After the murder, Christie stashed Ruth's body under the floorboards in his living room before later burying her in his back garden. Christie's next victim was Muriel Eady in 1944, and with her murder, we see him start to concoct elaborate schemes to lure in his victims. Muriel's life was unfortunately filled with tragedy from a very early age. She was born in West Ham on October 14th, 1912, and she was the youngest of 4 children. Her mother died when she was just 6 years old, and her father was so racked with grief from this loss, he could no longer raise Muriel and her 3 brothers, so he sent them to children's homes. She ended up being separated from her brothers and bounced around to different children's houses until 1923, when she moved in with her Aunt Ethel, who is an entirely different Ethel from Ethel Christie. I didn't realize there was going to be more than one Ethel in this story. I guess it was a much more common name at the time. Muriel's Aunt Ethel was very strict and forbade her from seeing boys. This was probably the most stable home Muriel had, though, since she lived with her Aunt Ethel until her death in 1939. Muriel held different domestic service jobs to support herself until 1940, when she moved in with her Aunt Martha and got a job on an assembly line in a company that manufactured radios. This job is where she would meet John Christie on April 20th, 1944. The two of them had a friendly relationship, and she had visited Christie's home before, but never on her own. Her Aunt Martha recalled her leaving the house on September 7th, 1944, at 4 p.m. with the intent to go shopping. Muriel didn't tell her aunt that she would be visiting John Christie's house. This would be the last time that Martha would see her alive. Christie told Muriel that he had an inhaler that would cure a chronic respiratory condition that she had. But in actuality, Christie made her inhale carbon monoxide gas, which incapacitated her while he then sexually assaulted her and strangled her with a pair of tights. He then buried Muriel's body beside Ruth's in the garden. Remember earlier, during the police investigation, when I mentioned children finding a human skull in a bombed-out abandoned building? This skull was actually Muriel's. A dog had dug it up out of the garden, and Christie threw it in this building to get rid of it. Next came the murders of Beryl and Geraldine Evans in 1949. Christie had claimed that he could provide Beryl with an abortion, but likely killed her in the same way as Muriel. He then strangled her daughter Geraldine with a tie. He likely kept their bodies in his house during the first police search of the property, and then planted them in the wash house for police to find on the second search, once he was convinced that he could pin the crime on Beryl's husband Timothy. After Christie's past criminal record was brought up by Timothy Evans' defense during his trial, he lost his job at the post office, and he had a difficult time keeping a job in the following years. The resulting tension in John's marriage with Ethel could have been a motive for him strangling her to death in December of 1952, although bizarrely he would later claim that she was choking to death anyway, and he had strangled her out of mercy. John put Ethel's body under the floorboards in his living room and presumably kept it there instead of burying it in the garden for security after what had happened with Muriel Eady's skull. Christie told his neighbors that his wife had moved back to Sheffield to stay with her family, and he told her family that she had fallen ill and couldn't talk to them, but he would send them gifts signed as coming from the both of them. Christie's neighbors started to complain of the smell coming from his house, and he started treating it with disinfectants to cover it up. With Ethel out of the picture, Christie's murders ramped up significantly, and he would go on to kill 3 more women in the next 3 months. He started in January of 1953 with Rita Nelson. Rita was born on October 16th, 1927, in Belfast, Ireland. She was raised in a very religious family, but fell out with them due to her rebellious nature. Throughout her teens and early 20s, she had a string of run-ins with the law for crimes like theft and prostitution. She had had a close brush with death as a teenager when she was strangled so badly by a man that her hyoid bone in her throat broke. This never led to any charges, and her attacker never went to prison for it. In 1948, Rita had a son, only for her child to be taken out of her custody 2 years later. Throughout these next 3 years, she would bounce around through odd jobs and eventually make her way to London, where she got pregnant again. The last time she was seen alive was on January 16th, 1953, when she was around 6 months pregnant. Rita's landlady saw her leaving her apartment to send a letter to her mother, in which she wrote that she would soon be returning to Belfast to have her baby. It's not known exactly when Rita Nelson died, or how she met John Christie, but she seemingly went to his home willingly, as there was no evidence of a struggle found. Christie may have lured her in there by offering to terminate her pregnancy, just like he had with Beryl Evans, and then killed her according to his usual MO by incapacitating her with carbon monoxide and then sexually assaulting her while strangling her. Christie then wrapped her body in a blanket and hid it in a kitchen alcove behind his cupboards. This would become his new preferred hiding space for bodies for the next couple months. Christie continued his streak of murders in February of 1953 with Kathleen Maloney. Kathleen was born in Plymouth on August 19, 1926. She and her mother, father, and 2 sisters all lived together in poverty in a rundown apartment that they shared with 3 other families. Kathleen's mother and father both died in 1931 when she was only 5 years old, and after this she was separated from her sisters and sent to a strict Catholic orphanage. After the start of World War II, Kathleen and the other girls at the orphanage were moved to a building that was also being used to house the military, and it's here that she was introduced to sex work when she was still only a teenager. In 1944, she hitchhiked 200 miles to London, but she had nowhere to stay. So for the next several years, she was bouncing between homelessness and several short prison sentences for minor crimes. She got pregnant several times and gave 5 children up for adoption. Kathleen was 4 months pregnant with her 6th child when she met John Christie. Perhaps also being lured in by him promising to provide her with an abortion, Christie murdered her in the same way as Rita Nelson in February of 1953, and he placed her body right beside Rita's in the kitchen alcove. Christie's last murder was in March of 1953, the murder of Hectorina McLennan. Hectorina was born on February 18th, 1926, in Glasgow, Scotland. She came from a big family of 5 siblings, and one day dreamed of starting her own. In 1941, at the age of 15, she met her future husband, a Burmese soldier in the Royal Air Force, and she moved on to the base while they started their family. Later on, in 1948, Hectorina's whole family would make the move from Glasgow to West London to be closer together, and Hectorina would move in with them while her husband was stationed in Cardiff. This location put her only a couple miles away from John Christie's house at 10 Rillington Place. That brings us to the 50s, when things started to take an unfortunate turn for Hectorina. Just after the birth of their 2nd child in 1951, her husband left the family to return to Burma. That next year, Hectorina's family moved back to Scotland, taking her 2 children with them. Hectorina ended up staying behind in London, all on her own. She began a job as a nanny to support herself, but she soon began an affair with the man whose children she was caring for. And once his wife found out, she threw them both out, and they were homeless and looking for places to stay. In early March of 1953, the 2 of them met John Christie, who offered them a place to stay in his home, and from there, Christie's only concern was getting the man out of the picture so that he could be with Hectorina alone. On March 6, 1953, the 3 of them went out for the day at 9:30 a.m., and Hectorina agreed to meet with Christie back at the house at noon. She was supposed to meet back up with her partner at a cafe at 3 p.m., but was never able to. Christie killed her in his usual fashion and stuffed her body in the kitchen alcove with the others. What these 4 murders in 4 months tell me is that John Christie was unraveling, and fast. His next move was trying to escape the consequences of his own actions. At this point, his house was full of bodies. 3 in the kitchen alcove, his wife in the floorboards, 2 in the back garden. He tried to cover his tracks by wallpapering over the bodies in the kitchen alcove and trying to sublet his apartment to another family. Christie left the home on March 20th, 1953, after taking 3 months' rent from the new tenants, who were then kicked out by the landlord because the subletting was not authorized. When the kitchen was being renovated by new tenants soon afterward, the 3 bodies in the kitchen alcove were discovered, leading to a thorough search of the property, the discovery of all 6 bodies, and a warrant out for Christie's arrest. The manhunt for Christie would turn out to be short-lived, as he was found by police only 10 days later, having run out of money already. Once he was arrested, he admitted to the murders of all 6 women found on the property, as well as the murder of Beryl Evans. Christie's trial began on June 22, 1953, and he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution pointed out that Christie took great care to conceal his murders after committing them, proving that he was of sound mind at the time, and the jury came back with a verdict of guilty. Christie was executed by hanging on July 15, 1953. So you'd think, now that the real killer of Beryl and Geraldine Evans was executed, that Timothy Evans' name would be cleared, right? Well, turns out that the courts rarely like to admit when they're wrong. After Christie's trial, there was an investigation done to determine if Evans was actually guilty. This first investigation concluded after only 11 days, and it was determined that he was indeed guilty, and I guess they really believed that while there was an active serial killer in the building, that Evans just happened to kill his wife and child in the exact same way that the serial killer living downstairs would, and it was just completely unconnected somehow. A second investigation was done after 2 years, which uncovered the evidence that police had suppressed in the initial investigation and the methods that they used to extract Evans' confession. The matter wouldn't be brought up again until over 10 years later, in 1965, when an inquiry into the case would conclude that Evans did kill his wife, but not his daughter, which makes even less sense to me than the first theory, because Beryl and Geraldine were both killed at the same time in the same way, and their bodies were found together. Are we just supposed to believe that Evans killed Beryl and then Geraldine just died for reasons? I don't know about that. But as a result of this inquiry, Evans was granted a posthumous pardon. Even after this, his name wasn't cleared until 2003, when finally, after over 50 years, his family received financial compensation for his wrongful execution. This case was absolutely a factor in capital punishment being outlawed in the UK in 1969, but of course here in the US, it's still very much a thing. Regardless of where you stand on this issue, the fact is you can't unexecute someone, and wrongful convictions happen way more often than you might think. I definitely want to look into other cases of wrongful convictions and executions throughout history, because in some cases I definitely think these wrongful convictions could have been avoided. Whether it's a genuine mistake, laziness, or willful corruption, there are many cases throughout history that could have been solved properly the first time if it weren't for the police. Those types of cases are of a particular interest to me, and I definitely want to cover more of them on this channel going forward. So that was the story of the crimes of John Christie and the wrongful execution of Timothy Evans. Coming up next week, I'll be posting the finale of my playthrough of Famicom Detective Club, The Girl Who Stands Behind, as well as delving into the mystery of one of my favorite cryptids, Mothman. A huge thank you to Salika and Smallsy, who are my supporters on Ko-Fi. If you want to see all my videos early or join my Sub of the Month Club, you can support me on Ko-Fi at ko-fi.com/SpinnBlend. Thanks so much for watching.